Before I take you down the menstruation care lane, let's take a bow to all the superwomen in history who dealt with their periods before the menstrual products came along, because in ancient times panties were not even invented yet, so you can only imagine the horrors of periods back in the days. Menstrual products have been in use far longer than we have been using calendars to track the passage of time. Nowadays we have access to disposable pads and tampons. The truth is that these products haven't been around for that long. In fact, for centuries women had to come up with their own ways of dealing with their periods. So let's dive into the dark, horrifying history of period products and tampons. This is History Rediscovered. To support, please subscribe. How did women actually cope with their periods? Menstruation is a touchy subject for some people, especially young girls who may feel embarrassed to ask their parents about it. However, things were even more complicated in the past. In fact, for a long time there wasn't even a proper term to describe menstruation, let alone any products to help women deal with it. Before the 20th century, menstruation was a relatively rare occurrence for women. Most of their time was spent either giving birth or breastfeeding. Plus, their diets were often so poor that their periods could disappear due to malnutrition. As a result, a woman might only have 10 to 15 periods in her entire lifetime. But just because periods were infrequent, that didn't mean they weren't happening. So they had to find ways to deal with it. The earliest historical evidence of tampon use can be found in ancient Egyptian medical records. The women of Egypt used papyrus as tampons, which was a kind of paper used to write on, by soaking it in water. Papyrus wasn't the only material used in early tampons. Women got seriously creative by adding cotton and other things. In the 5th century BC, Greek women fashioned their protection by wrapping lint around a small piece of wood, according to writings of Hippocrates, a physician considered to be the father of Western medicine. Romans, meanwhile, used wool and vegetable fibers. Other materials have included paper. Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder wrote that women during their periods had extraordinary powers, such as the ability to summon lightning or destroy crops. In the Middle Ages, back then, the word menstruation didn't even exist, and women were considered dirty and dangerous during their period. The mere idea of menstrual blood was enough to send people running for the hills, convinced that the devil was lurking around the corner. So if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, chances are you spent most of your period alone in a corner somewhere, trying not to infect anyone with your womanly curse. Women from the 11th century were able to choose from a number of ways to address your monthly problems. For instance, if you were fortunate enough to be a noblewoman, you could acquire expensive menstrual pads made of fine linen or even rabbit fur, or you could push bits of cloth between your legs and pray for the best. If you were a peasant, you had to be resourceful. Some women might use leftover wool or pieces of old clothing or other types of fabric. Additionally, if you were in a desperate situation, try a dead frog. Apparently, wearing a dried-up frog around your waist would relieve your pains and lighten your menstruation. But unfortunately, not everyone liked the frog trick, and some thought it was extremely risky because they thought menstrual blood was a poison that could sicken and infect you from head to toe. In order to prevent this destiny, they recommended women to keep away from men while they were on their period, and to avoid eating anything that might go bad, because it was believed that menstrual blood might cause bread to decay. Hawaiian women used the furry part of the native hapuu fern, while women in ancient Japan fashioned tampons out of paper and used bandages to hold them in place. In Africa and Australia, women used grass to deal with period blood. The Chinese women cared for the flow by wrapping sand in a piece of clothing. The blood-soaked sand was thrown later, and the cloth was saved to be used later. Mosses were also used as the material to soak blood between the cloth in some parts of the globe. 1900s to 1920s. The products from these 2 decades were heavily influenced from lessons learned during WW1. Nurses first discovered that cellulose, the most abundant organic polymer, was a better material than cloth bandages for absorbing blood. Nurses saw how well the cellulose bandages they were using on wounded soldiers were able to absorb blood, that they started fashioning tampons from them for their own personal use. The first sanitary napkin product to achieve commercial success was the Kotex brand, which was created from leftover high-absorption battle bandages. The belts are essentially elastic waistbands that fit around a person's waist and have two clips, one in the front and one in the back, affixed to them. The clips would be used to pass a towel from front to rear that would soak up the menstrual blood. These belts were the standard up until the 1970s, but they are now generally disregarded. The contemporary tampon, with applicator, was created and patented in 1929 by a doctor by the name of Dr. Earl Haas. The French term for plug is where the name tampon comes from. Many women at the time used large, bulky sanitary pads that were fastened to belts. On a trip to California, he got the inspiration after hearing from a friend how she had improvised a more comfortable and functional replacement for the widely used and bulky external pads by merely inserting a piece of sponge on the inside, rather than the outside. He believed a compressed type of cotton would absorb equally as effectively because at the time, doctors were employing cotton plugs to stop secretions. After a bit of experimenting, he settled on a design that featured a tightly bound strip of absorbent cotton attached to a string to allow for easy removal. To keep the tampon clean, the cotton came with an applicator tube that extended to push the cotton into place without the user having to touch it. 1930s to 1940s, there was an explosion of innovative inventions in vintage goods throughout the 1930s. Modern disposable tampons were first patented in 1933 under the trade name Tampax. Due to sanitary concerns regarding the exposure of pads to fecal germs, healthcare practitioners decided that tampons were a superior alternative. After learning how to insert tampons correctly, the majority of women stopped using pads, according to interviews conducted for medical and commercial purposes. However, due to ethical concerns about virginity, masturbation, and the possibility of using them as contraceptives, many societies were reluctant to accept tampons. However, because tampons were still viewed with suspicion, advances in pads took off. German gynecologist Dr. Judith Esser-Mittig created the non-applicator tampon in the 1940s. It gained popularity because of the protection it offers and its discreet size. The tampon's groundbreaking design not only met women's desire for concealment, but it also did so. In 1956, Mary Kenner, a female African-American inventor, invented the first sanitary belt with an adhesive to secure the pad in place. She created an adjustable sanitary belt with a moisture-proof napkin pocket built in. Her patent for the sanitary belt, unfortunately, was dismissed for 30 years due to racial discrimination. Women today find this menstrual pad to be incredibly useful. You absolute icon Mary, thank you. 1950s to 1990. The Kotex's Kotam stick, a hybrid applicator tampon that looked somewhat like a tampon on the end of a stick, was developed in the 1960s, and in the 1970s women saw the introduction of tampons with two withdrawal strings. In 1971, Playtex released scented tampons and introduced plastic, dome-tipped applicators in 1973. Then in 1975, Procter & Gamble brought out a new tampon called Rely. It was designed to expand both vertically and horizontally. It was shaped like a tea bag and made of entirely synthetic materials, which made it super absorbent. Between 1979 and 1996, over 5,000 cases of toxic shock syndrome were documented, causing widespread concern, which was found to be a direct result from the using Rely and other tampons made with synthetic materials. Tampons have come a long way, and we are eternally grateful for the advancements. Rail takes period care technology several steps further, ensuring that your period care items are the safest for your body and the environment. Feel empowered by your period with luxurious, holistic period care from Rail.